For the first time, an American plane was shot down yesterday over Iran. It was an F-15 with both the pilot and the navigator ejecting when the ejection seat was about to reach the ground. Obviously, the crew will have survival equipment, water, food, and communication devices to report their position and situation if they're able, of course, as well as means to protect themselves. And here we're generally just talking about a handgun, so that's not really something that would allow you to protect yourself against dozens of armed people coming with Kalashnikovs. So once the crash is confirmed, you have an American armada that will take off. And in this context, you logically have planes that will provide what's called close air support to be able to prevent any remaining Iranian forces in the area from trying to capture those pilots. Potentially, they will destroy bridges, they will destroy the surroundings, and as soon as any soldiers are visible, in any case, they will try to prevent them from moving. Then you have all the electronic warfare equipment, which will make sure to shut down any remaining radars in the area, even though, objectively, I think nothing was working anymore. And so it's really about being able to block communications, since jamming isn't just against radars. Then you have the recovery assets, you have helicopters, UH-60 helicopters, and their refuelable variants. Since when you're at such great distances, you have to have in-flight refueling. And as we see in these videos, some of the helicopters need to be refueled to be able to make long-distance round trips. And so you have Hercules C-130 planes modified as tankers to be able to fly at very, very low altitude. And all these assets, they come under fire, they're shot at, often with simple machine guns. And we also see this C-130 releasing flares. That means there are certainly heat flares being released to counter a Manpads missile that might have been launched from the ground. So we know that the first pilot was recovered relatively quickly in the afternoon. That means they really deployed all available resources during the day, even though it's quite dangerous. In order to recover him, there's a recovery procedure. Now, I can tell you about my personal experience. I was a crew member on the Atlantique II maritime patrol aircraft, and in that role, we are trained for different emergency situations. For example, there's the Rescue Training Center for sea crash scenarios. It's called the C-100 in there. We do a number of exercises. If we fall into the water and the parachute pulls us, how do we avoid drowning? How do we get out of a submerged cabin at night with a helmet on and upside down? How do we activate the strobe lights to be detected? We get hoisted up. So for me, in 2002, it was still a Super Freeland, so the biggest helicopters that existed in the French Navy. There is also the Mountain Rescue Center that was managed by the Air Force. So that involved skiing in the mountains. We made igloos. We learned to survive in the cold, in the snow, and so on. And much later in 2024, I had the chance to see the Jungle Training Center. And there, same thing, besides the training, to learn how to build a fire, make a hammock, not get eaten by tarantulas, and also recognize the different foods you can eat. Obviously, that's really about surviving in those environments, and then there are the extraction procedures. And same thing, I did that once in Lorient with the commandos there. Basically, I'm not going to give you all the details, obviously, but there are procedures. We have passwords to be able to identify if there's a trap around us, or if, for example, we have a bomb on us. And so they come, the commandos, they put the gun to your head, and that way they know how to identify us. That it isn't an imposter and that there's really no risk when they're coming to get us. That's certainly what happened with the first pilot who was able to be exfiltrated. And last night, there was still no information about the second pilot. You could still hear helicopters operating in the area, which proves that the rescue operations were continuing. There's also something important: the possible destruction of the F-15 on the ground. The F-15 must not be recovered, especially with encryption and coding methods that could potentially decode the communications between American planes, since you know that the encryption keys are normally self-destructed. But it's better to destroy the equipment as well to be sure there will never be a leak, and therefore no recovery by the Americans. So the nighttime operations, how do they work? Contrary to what one might think, it's actually an advantage for the Americans since it's obviously a very, very high-tech military. They all have night vision binoculars, they all have light amplification goggles. So probably more than the Iranians who will try to move around in the area. Also, the aircraft is less sensitive to being shot at, or simply to being targeted by a shoulder-fired Manpads missile, which could be fired from the shoulder. Since you have to lock on in the sky for it to be able to fire at night, it's probably less dangerous for the crews as well. And for the personnel on the ground to make themselves identifiable, they have what's called a strobe. That means you have a kind of light flash that will send a code allowing it to be uniquely identified, and this flash will be very directional and only upwards. So logically, since the Iranians no longer have any way to launch anything, it's upwards. So only the Americans will be able to see it. And there, besides all the planes and helicopters, you certainly have plenty of drones that are also present, MQ-9 Reapers. I remind you that the Americans have deployed dozens and dozens of them, and they can afford to put these drones in danger simply because there's no human life at stake. Inside, they cost a few million euros, and so they make them carry out some of the most dangerous missions. They've still lost 16 of them since the beginning, and so we can assume that this type of device is flying over the area and was flying over to be able to identify and locate the position of this second pilot. The problem is that daytime operations are particularly dangerous, and that 2 helicopters were reportedly damaged after coming under fire, so they stopped their rescue operations to wait for nightfall and resume operations during the night. There were confirmed reports of noise from helicopters flying over the area, which means, once again, that, well, certainly another rescue team with commandos came to the area. And this morning, we still don't have any information to know if the second crew member, apparently the navigator, has been exfiltrated. There is no news. I suppose it will still be relatively quick if he is alive. The longest anyone survived was an American pilot who ejected in June 1995 over Bosnia and Herzegovina, and he survived for 6 days before the rescue teams could come get him. And during those 6 days, he had run out of his food rations. And I still remember I was 14 years old at the time. And I was struck by the fact that he explained he survived by eating snails. That too is part of survival. So now we also have to ask the question, why? Why do the Americans keep losing planes when they're supposed to be in an environment where they claim to have destroyed all of the Iranian air defense equipment? And in reality, that's relatively realistic. There are no more radars to lock onto a target with heavy air defense systems. But there are other ways, alternatives, especially infrared systems. And the various images we've seen since the beginning actually prove that the Iranians still have this equipment. Because they're silent, they're passive. A radar will get detected. An infrared camera doesn't get detected from the sky. And when the infrared camera allows you to lock onto a target and fire anti-aircraft missiles, including missiles that can go relatively far, well, that's something the plane doesn't know when it's being targeted. That's the principle of IRST in fighter jets. And I refer you to the videos where I explain the concept of stealth. And so, all planes, even stealth planes, can be locked onto by this type of equipment. And we saw it a few days ago with the American F-35 that was hit, that was damaged, the pilot was injured, but he was able to return to his base. But nevertheless, it does mean that the Iranians will always have light detection systems and the ability to fire these missiles. For example, missiles like the R-73, which is normally an air-to-air missile, fired, for example, by MiG-29S old Soviet planes, and which will lock onto a target at a distance, visually, optically, and these R-73s, there are plenty of countries that have adapted them to be launched from the ground. So even if the Iranians no longer have fighter jets to try to defend themselves, they can fire the same types of missiles from the ground at a target that has been visually locked on. And the problem for the F-35, obviously, as we saw, it didn't have any decoys to protect it. I refer you to the videos I made dedicated to this issue. Normally, a plane is able to release a series of red flares that are hotter than its engines, which will attract the missiles. We don't see any protection on the F-35 or the F-15. I don't know how many missiles it was hit by, or if missiles even shot it down, or if it was a technical issue. We still don't know. In that case, there are, and there will always be, low-intensity systems present in Iran. That doesn't call into question the almost total supremacy of the United States over the area, or the entire airspace they've opened up, including with very heavy aircraft like the B-52, which specifically require air superiority. At first, you send in stealth aircraft, the B-2, the F-35 if necessary, even though, once again, you can destroy air defenses from very far away without getting close to them. The Ukrainians prove this to us every day. And then, when there really is no protection left, you can bring in the large aircraft, the C-130s for rescue missions, and possibly the B-52s. They are bomb trucks that are not expensive at all, because these big planes will be able to carry 30 tons of bombs, up to 100 bombs, each one unique, individual. Having targeting for a very, very precise target, up to 100 kilometers around the plane, these are glide bombs, and they cost very little. And this allows the United States today to increase their firepower over Iranian territory by using fewer resources and cheaper resources. A month ago, they had to fire Tomahawk cruise missiles, which are very, very expensive, to be able to strike from 1,000 kilometers away without putting the crew's lives in danger. Today, the environment is much more permissive, so they can send these large aircraft directly. The Americans, for now, obviously have been lucky. They haven't lost any yet, but there is still an accumulation of incidents. As I was saying, with F-15s shot down in Kuwait, and in that case, it was friendly fire, the Kuwaitis targeted the wrong aircraft. There were still a number of aircraft that were hit on the ground because the Americans were not prepared to defend themselves, especially against drones. And their air bases are not equipped to intercept Iranian Shahed drones, unlike the Ukrainians.